I welcome you to the 2023 Zoom lecture series hosted by the Franciscan School of Theology. Our presenter tonight is Jim Sabak, O.F.M, a Franciscan Friar of the Province of the Most Holy Name of Jesus. Born in Seattle, Washington, he received his doctorate in Sacramental Theology, Liturgy from the Catholic University of America in 2012. Jim currently holds the position of Director of Worship for the Diocese of Raleigh, North Carolina, and Episcopal emcee for the Bishop of Raleigh. He has taught at Siena College in Albany, New York, Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and here at the Franciscan School of Theology. In addition to writing for various journals, Jim also hosts the Potential to Be Amazing podcast with his friend and colleague, Mike Watson. Jim's presentation tonight fits in with last weekend's celebration of the Solemnity of the Body and Blood of Christ. Tonight, he will answer the question, Franciscan Theology of the Eucharist, does it inform our lives? Thank you. Welcome, Father Sabak.
Good evening, everybody. I am in Raleigh, North Carolina right now, and so it is a little after 10 o'clock in the evening. So late night catechism. I think that was a play on Broadway for a while. So this is what we're really doing tonight. I also see that there are a few other people also from the East Coast on the Zoom. So thank you all for being a part of this. As Sister Juliet said, the Eucharistic theology from a Franciscan perspective, how does it inform our lives? To kind of just take a look at that for a little while, because there is something that is wonderful about what it is that the Franciscan movement contributed and brought to an understanding of Eucharist that in some ways we kind of need to retrieve. We kind of have to understand this better, because things always start out in one direction of sort of freshness and a newness and a novelty. But then sometimes we get locked into like a stream of generalizations on things. And somehow that has happened, I think, in one way with our understanding of, especially from a Franciscan perspective. And so we kind of need to go back to our roots to see really what it offers and what it contributes, to a better and fuller understanding of the role of Eucharist in our lives. So to begin with, you always got to go back to the Middle Ages. And again, like most people would sometimes think, the Middle Ages were a benighted time in which people were not very smart, or else they were struggling to be smart and couldn't accomplish much and things like that. And so we just have big cathedrals and that's about it. That's not necessarily the case, that there's a lot to the Middle Ages, a lot to the medieval period that we really could continue to learn from, and that we need to kind of look back and kind of sift through a lot of what it is that the medieval world was trying to deal with, that in some ways we're still trying to deal with today. So in the time period that Francis is living, we do have a time, we could say, of distancing, that there is this sense, because of a variety of things that have affected human life and the trajectory of history, that you begin to get this distancing, primarily of the human from God. That there is this sense in which God becomes more and more a figure in the clouds. Again, this great father figure who people wonder, does he really have any kind of idea of what human life is like? And does he have any kind of idea of what it is that we are going through? Because again, in this time period of plagues and wars and pestilences and what have you, what was also more local was that you begin to get this whole idea of a further rise of the clergy seeing themselves as a professional class. And with that happens basically a distancing between the clerics and the laity. And this is always something very important always to remember, is that Jesus does not make priests. Even though we want to have Holy Thursday be kind of the feast of priests and things like that, it always makes me shudder, because that's not what's going on that day. And although at the Chrism Mass that blesses the oils, there's kind of this reaffirmation of priests, priestly duties and what have you, that only comes in after Vatican II, and that comes in the 1970s when most priests are leaving the priesthood for better fields. And so it kind of comes into the liturgy as a way to preserve, what priesthood there was. And it's all a very sketchy kind of a thing. The idea of priesthood sometimes comes, more scholars will say, because like in ancient times, gods and goddesses needed a priesthood to sort of manage them, so too now this understanding of priesthood arises as a way to manage God, for people. And so liturgy is done on behalf of or for humanity, really without any involvement of humanity, in the process. It's better for us to do this with God than it is for you to get involved with it, because if you get your hands in it, it's probably going to get messy and God's going to be offended. And God already is distant from us. We don't want to make God any more distant from us. So within all of this, you have a church, that's caught between culture and its own mission. The sense of culture focusing at this time upon power, control, legislation, the rise of nation states, the rise of the middle class, all these things that are going on, the culture of that time is sort of focused in on that way, kind of like our culture is sort of focused on it too nowadays. But then you also have a church whose mission is supposed to be communal. It's supposed to be embracing the more of us, that idea of the spiritual as being the more of us, not something that is moving to heaven and into otherworldly kind of things, but the fullness of what it means to be human. And also, again, the mission of the church being something that everyone who is baptized is supposed to share in some way, shape, or form. So this kind of context, is where Francis is arising within. All of this, again, is affecting church life, especially in the administration of the sacraments. Because again, the sacraments become the preserve of priests, and they're the ones who are responsible for making sure that what gets done, but not necessarily in a way that could involve people, in a way to appreciate and to integrate that in what the sacraments are, and to really help them become, again, what it means to be a faith-filled person, a faith-filled believer. So within, with all of these tensions, there is always the sense in which, the faithful have not abandoned the Eucharist. Again, the sense in which, that there is this desire for the Eucharist on behalf of the faithful. It isn't sort of a distancing of themselves from that, although there is this distancing that's happening between clerics and laity, and people may be feeling that distance because of that, of themselves from God. And so there is a sense, it's that the faithful basically decide that they want to contemplate, that they try to adore, even from a distance, what is going on with the Eucharist and how the Eucharist is being experienced. And what's happening is that there's a nurturing of an intensely active and very communal piety, because again, the people are desiring a relationship with this Christ, a relationship with Jesus, a relationship with God. And if they cannot receive him, physically by eating and drinking him, then they are going to substitute this with some kind of contemplative adoration. But again, not something that is done individually, not something that is done just for oneself, but it is the sense in which there is this communal understanding that they are in this together, because it in some way they are realizing it shapes them and who and what they are. Again, this idea is that for the medievals, worship, liturgy, Christian life was never privatized. It was never something you did on your own. It was where your identity was built upon, where your identity came from. All of that has a profound impact on St. Francis. And again, while he spends much time in private prayer, it never diminishes or weakens, a sense of the role of Eucharist or privatize it. He always has this sense, in which he was a part of something more than just himself, in this intensely, social and cultural communal ethic. You could never be alone in the medieval world. To be alone, basically, was to be apart from everything, to be in exile, to be pushed out of the city, to be pushed out of the town, was something that was incredibly dangerous, because it basically would pitch you against the forces of nature alone. And the sense of being together, being communal, being a part of this greater work, of this greater reality, this greater truth, was what was the cement, that made relationship and life in the medieval world what it was meant to be. So again, Francis, in his own understanding of things, he helped to grow in some ways. He helped to nurture in some ways this intense communal ethic. Again, there may be divisions and distinctions among classes, but again, it was a highly social age. And if you read anything about the medieval world, it was defined by feasts and rituals. I mean, it inherits that, from Rome. Rome, more times than not in the calendar in ancient Rome, there was some kind of festival or some kind of feast. There were thousands of them that arose every which way you could. The same thing carries into the medieval period, is that feasts and rituals, defined bringing the community together and making sure the community understood itself through these rituals and through these feasts. It ended up in some ways, because of that, preserving a participatory nature of worship, in spite of, again, some misguided, ill-informed leadership and practice. Again, sometimes we get this idea that we need to preserve God from us, or we need to preserve God from God's self. We have that today to some extent, that we're trying to make sure that God is protected. And if we have that idea, it's rather ridiculous. God doesn't need to be protected. God is God. But that idea would not have come into the medieval thinking, even though there was the sense in which priests are arising in their sense of their duties, and making those duties, although they're being done on behalf of other people, something that makes them special and better human perhaps than everybody else. There still is this sense, among the faithful, among the masses, that we need to be involved in this. We need to be a part of this, and we got to find some way in which we could do that. Again, Eucharist was never ever thought to be an object for personal devotion. It just would not have made sense. It was something that was created, that was given as a gift for people and for people to gather around. Again, Eucharist was a focus for a community in communion. Again, despite priestly control and all these kind of things like that they understood that this meal was something important that they needed to share in somehow, some way. Again, it was of vital importance then to the community. It was something the community had to make sure that they participated in, that they shared in somehow, some way. So within that, begin to think in some ways that Eucharist itself functions as a litmus test of ideology or identity and belonging, not ideology, of identity and belonging. Again, those who could participate in Eucharist, those who could at least witness it, those who could approach it, knew themselves to be a part of something greater than just themselves, which again is why in many ways Islam and Judaism were always on the outs, because they were prohibited from participating in Eucharist and being a part of it. So they were always the outsiders. Although they could be welcomed in and could be part to some degree of the community, they were never part of its core, because they could not share in Eucharist like the rest of the Christians could. Again, it was this mark of membership in the community. It made you understand yourself to be part of something greater than yourself. And again, for the faithful, it was never, even though they were not directly involved in it and could share in it, they never really experienced themselves or thought of themselves as having a passive role within all of this. And again, they would use alternative outlets to express the centrality of Eucharist in ways that they could, in ways that they could understand, and they could engage this. And so within all of this kind of understanding of this period of, again, in the Middle Ages, in the medieval world, basically you can come up with, again, ways in which also that they would never ever separate themselves from the larger church. Those who tried to do that, who tried to dismantle the church, were those who were understood not really embracing the Eucharist as it should be embraced. And that, again, always put them on the outs. People would be attached to them, people could be attracted to them, but those who tried to break from the church or separate themselves from the church to be able to approach the Eucharist on their own were always seen as people who were not part of the community and not living the Eucharist truly. So within all of this, basically, you have kind of 5 aspects, of Franciscan Eucharistic theology that sort of arises out of that. And again, it arises out of Francis's time and his experience. Francis does not write a lot about the Eucharist, but he does mention it significantly in different parts. It is the rest of the Franciscans who follow after him who begin to devise and to elaborate on that. And even now, even today, begin to take a look and see, well, what is it that we can take from this? What is it that we can learn from all of this contribution to understanding Eucharistic theology? So 5 aspects: presence in union, the great condescension of God, not condensation, condescension of God. God condescends. Now, to condescend might not necessarily be a very good word in today's language, but theologically, there's something very powerful when that word is applied, to God. The role of the symbolic. Again, even today, to understand truly what symbol means, something that the Franciscans kind of worked with and tried to understand, really comes out of Francis and his own in his own time frame, his own cultural history. The nature of Eucharist as gift. What does it mean for God to give us this, for Christ to give us this? How do we understand this as a gift? And then the fifth aspect is the importance of order and communion. So just to kind of take a look a little bit at each of these little five things, again, and what they contribute to understanding of Franciscan theology. So presence and union. Again, today we talk a lot about Eucharistic presence, and the reality is, whenever we talk about Eucharistic presence, again, this is in monstrances, in adoration, those kinds of things like that, real presence, blah, blah, blah. That's not a Franciscan way of approaching it. To say it for what it is, it's a Dominican way of approaching it, and that has its attributes and its goodness, and it's there, but it isn't Franciscan. And so again, I just kind of tell people that all the time. They'll go, why? But it isn't, because for Franciscans, for Dominicans, that presence is static. It's there to be adored, and so it kind of and it's the real presence that's there. A lot of the Reformation moves into that kind of thinking of that, in the Counter-Reformation in the 1500s and things like that. Because Franciscans were beating each other up and dividing and dividing and dividing, we never really contributed to the Counter-Reformation in a big way. So we kind of kept this to ourselves. But this presence for the medievals and again, and for the early Franciscans, was a dynamic presence. It was a living, organic, it was vibrant. It was a presence that was to, for, and with another. Again, taking from its standpoint what Jesus says at the end of the Gospels before the Ascension, behold, I am with you always. That profound nature, again, don't just look at me, live with me, be a part of my life. That understanding of presence was powerful in Franciscan understanding. It contributed, again, to the missionary activity of the church. We could do all that we could do. Francis could do all that he could do. The early Franciscans could do all that they could do because Christ was with us always. The presence was always there. And again, this sense of how it worked, to unite all of creation in Christ because of that awareness of that presence being there. Again, echoing again, who Emmanuel was. And again, the great incarnational aspects of Francis, again, Greccio, baby, crib, nativity scene, all those kinds of things. Again, Franciscans take off on that. Emmanuel is God with us. And so this presence is with us, not apart from us, not to be taken out and displayed. It's meant to be lived. It's meant to be lived. And the question is always, how do we live it? And how can we best live it? Again, what happens with that presence is that it's supposed to help us recognize, the footprints of God in all creation. And then that's, that transfers, into seeing the sacraments, as traces of these footprints in creation. Scotus begins to touch upon this. Alexander of Hales, touches upon this. And again, that power that's in that sort of understanding of God's footprints in creation being experienced, in the sacraments. Again, they would not have gone perhaps as poetically as that, into it, but they knew that there were aspects of God that were experienced through our sacramental engagement, our sacramental encounters. And the Eucharist then, becomes the locus, becomes a centerpiece, of incarnational relationship. God becomes one with us, again, that we might become one with God. It's Irenaeus of Lyon, yes, but it's also Francis really reminding people and taking that to the next level, and really reinforcing the fact, again, this child that is born for us is meant for relationship with us, not just to be adored. Bonaventure always spoke of Eucharist as effective remembrance. Again, that we remember so that something touches our lives. We remember so that something begins to shape and transform us inside. It isn't a static, passive experience. To be a part of the presence and union of Christ in the Eucharist is meant to have, our lives transformed again and again and again. It's this deepening and deepening and deepening. And because of that, basically, Bonaventure could talk about Eucharist as being food that indeed sustains and refreshes. It allows us to see ourselves in a fuller way that everything else can't. That anything else that the world provides cannot allow us. So along with that, the second part of this, the great condescension of God, again, a God who is not disdainful of us, who is not arrogant towards us, who is not aloof. Again, just contrary to the thinking that's going around in Francis's time, what Francis understood, was a God who basically self-empties, who gives away, who gives over. Again, that's what incarnation was for him. That's what incarnation should be for all of us, is recognizing the fact that the God who so passionately wants to be a part of creation, that God goes to the ridiculous and absurd extreme of saying, I'm giving up everything that is divine and holy and what have you, and I'm going to become part of all of it, with all of its crap and its sorrow and its challenges and its struggles, but its joys, its wonders, all of that this God wants to experience this, which no other deity in anybody's imagination, ever would want to do. But our God does this. So God condescends, self-empties, gives away, because God wants to be a part of our life. And again, that's the incarnation. Again, it demonstrated the depths of God's condescension. God basically said, this is beautiful, and it cannot recognize how beautiful it is. And so God comes, to basically show us the way. Christ shows us the way. And so the active presence in the Eucharist is really an expression of the great humility of God, that ceaselessly leaves the lofty heavens to share God's self with God's creation. This is Francis's understanding of this. Again, this whole idea, again, to want to share his self with creation, to share God's self with creation. The whole point of why there is incarnation, of why there is then Eucharist, is to have that experience of a God who is sharing God's very self with us. And again, it also then expresses a God who never stops coming to us, perhaps to the point of weariness, but who himself is never wearied, who in God's self is never wearied. That's the great wonder. Again, why does God keep coming to us? It's because we can't get it right. It's because we refuse to get it right, because we live thinking that it's just not good, or it's too good to be true. Again, it's a wonderful Franciscan idea in which we begin to realize, what? It isn't too good to be true, because it is. And so we need to just embrace it and love it and run with it. And it's this God who keeps coming to us saying, please, realize this, listen to it, follow me, because I'll never stop coming to you. I'll never stop being a part of that, trying to let you see the more that is you, the more that is this world. Within that, then, the role of the symbolic, and how this operates to open us up to that more. Again, the symbolic always directs one to the most true and the most real of something. It isn't just something that stands in for something else. It isn't just a fake whatever. It is something that reveals the most true and the most authentic, the most real of something. Again, those footprints that are the sacraments, they help us to understand, to apprehend the deeper meanings of creation. What does it mean to eat, to drink? What does it mean, to bathe, to be washed? What does it mean to forgive and to let go and to embrace? What does it mean, to be healed? Those deeper meanings of creation, to be part of this world around us. Again, these footprints of the sacraments, they help us open up, the more and the most true real of something. That we experience on a daily basis. The emphasis is always for Francis, and then in the Franciscan tradition, emphasis is always on the one who receives the symbol. So it's always on us. Again, sometimes we take a look at sacraments, we take a look at the Eucharist, and it's all Jesus, 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 Jesus. And yes, it is Jesus, 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 but it's Jesus for us. It's about us. It's always about us. And to think that we are not worthy is always problematic. Because if we weren't, then God wouldn't waste the time. And again, Lord, I am not worthy to receive you, blah, 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 blah. You have to remember where it comes from in Scripture. That centurion or the synagogue official, who knows, it's different people in different Gospels, but it's a person who basically realizes that God can do all kinds of things. It's not a focus on us and our unworthiness. It's on a God who wants to be a part of us and wants to be a part of this life that we live. And so basically says, let me do something to help you realize how wonderful this life is. Let me in. And that's what we're saying, Lord, I am not worthy, but you can still do it, and you will. So, hey, I'm here, open up. That's the whole idea. The greatest condition of a receiver of the sacraments of the Eucharist is basically that they be a human being and a believer. That's all that's necessary, really. I mean, and even John Paul II in Unum Sint, I think it's paragraph 42 or something like that. He basically says, anybody who says I believe, should not be withheld from receiving Eucharist. And what kind of doors does that open? They don't have to go through RCIA practices or whatever it is. In Unum Sint, paragraph 42, if you say that you believe in this and what it is, well then, here it is. Receive, be happy, go, rejoice. That's us. That's the Franciscan understanding of things writ large. What that does then, again, in employing the most real of things, allows one then to live in the subjunctive mode of life. We don't have the subjunctive mode in our English grammar. It's in all other languages, but not in English. And so because of that, we suffer trying to understand what that means. But it's basically, to live in the subjunctive is the realm of the possible. The mays, the mights, those things that have potential. And when we live in thinking about what is possible in the imaginative, the creative, then we realize the perceptions of reality and truth, fuller senses of beauty and love that are hidden in the fabric of creation. We don't live in the subjunctive enough, especially as English-speaking people, which is why, again, that we need this fuller understanding of Eucharist, to be open, to those realizations. Because Eucharist is more than bread and wine. It's always more than bread and wine. It makes possible a fuller sense, of what it means to be together, what it means to be united, strengthening, again, an active life in the church, allowing us to be able to have the courage to go forth and say, because of my belief, I can imagine something different in this world than what the world can only see itself. That I will not be undone by fears and terrors and sadness and woe. I will feel all of those things, yes, but they will not be the final word for me. That there is always something much more powerful, which again was Francis's life. After kind of disappointment after disappointment after disappointment at times, he never ever gave up, because he believed that God knew what God was doing. And the symbolic puts us in touch with that. Gift. Eucharist is gift. Again, God bows down in compassion and love to offer God's most inmost reality, the truth of who and what God is. Again, it's something that informs us. Again, this wonderful Scotistic word, hektiatas. Dan Karam pronounces it a different way, but that's just him. But again, the sense of hektiatas, the thisness of something, the uniqueness of something, what makes it wonderful and glorious. Eucharist as gift embraces that. We receive Eucharist so that we might realize how wonderful and glorious we are. That is so wonderful, that each human person is wanted and loved by God, all apart from our own talents and our contributions. That's the bottom line always. Even Benedict XVI, he did love Bonaventure. He had wonderful things to say about this, early on. And he even talked about it even when he was Pope. But when he was Cardinal and he was teaching in Munich, this was kind of a centerpiece, for what his understanding of human life was about. That each human person is wanted by God, loved by God. That's a powerful understanding that sometimes we don't embrace enough, because all those other things get in the way. We can't let that, affect us in that way. Oh, wait a minute, sorry. I think just there. Thus, everything, depends upon God. Everything depends upon God. That there is the sense of contingency, that because God wants and loves us, then we also have to recognize the fact that we belong to God. It isn't an apartness that we need to kind of earn or gain. It is something that's already there. We just have to keep forgetting that it is. And so the sense of contingency, again, another Scotistic word, another John Donne Scotus word, allows us to be able to see that more. And that sharing in Eucharist basically relieves one of vain and purposeless strivings in life. It allows us, to be able to see the more of who we are and what we are, what we're called to be. And again, this is why Francis's own connection with the Eucharist, Francis's own connection with understanding what the Eucharist was all about, basically came out with that statement that he makes at the end of his life. The Lord gave me brothers. I did not ask God for this. I did not ask God for any of this. And yet God gave this to me that I might realize something more about myself I could not have realized on my own. And that was the whole point of community for Francis. Again, Benedictines get together, basically to serve God, together, and get away from the world and do that. And again, Dominicans get together, to get the Albigensians and the heretics, and also to study and things like that. The Jesuits get together to be smart. We got together kind of to be this kind of ragtag tumble of people, basically because God said, this is what you should do, this is what you should be. Which is, again, another wonderful awareness, another fantastic awareness, of what it means, to be a part of this movement and to be informed, by all of this. It's all God saying, I want you, I love you, and I want you to do this, even if you can't see it yourself. And so look at what I'm giving you. Look at what I'm giving you to be able to get this done. Eucharist is supposed to awaken us, to those times and places. And then finally, again, the importance of order, and communion. Today, those words seem mutually exclusive. We don't like them. Order means everybody's separated and things like that. Communion means we're all together. But for Francis, they were integrated and attuned together. There was an overriding concern, again, for all members of society. Sometimes you had to live by society's rules, yes, and it could be a little bit dicey in Francis's time. But there was this sense of concern for the larger welfare, which is why, the storming of the Rocca Maggiore, in Assisi, because, the aristocracy was not responding in this way. And so the commune comes in to reinforce that. Within that, again, Eucharist becomes at the center of all of this, again, expressing, like I said before, belonging and interconnectedness. And what Francis does is he affirms his and his order's place, in the greater church, always because he is reinforcing something that the culture itself is reinforcing, but he's reinforcing it in a better way. Yet within all of this, he is aware of the divisions. And he's also, in doing so, he kind of bypasses any clericalization of things. He tweaks practices, and so what you have, is that although Francis will write and the sources will write of Francis, sitting with the brothers before a tabernacle. Again, there were no monstrances yet. Monstrances come later in the Middle Ages, the early modern period, but sitting before a tabernacle and praying and communing with Christ that way. And why? Because you don't need a priest. Tabernacles are there. Just go in front of it, sit, pray, be together, experience Eucharist, and so he gets around, the necessity of a priest, but he doesn't break apart from it. And again, he wrote very lovingly about how we had to take care of priests because they couldn't take care of themselves most of the time because they were so crazy. But he gets around with this. And what this emphasizes basically is the idea of communio. It is the idea of togetherness, the idea of being togetherness. Kounio would be another kind of aspect of this, but kounio means to become just like one thing, this kind of together mass of people. Communio looks at everybody's differences and sees them all together and sees all of this, working together. And yet all of this is done, without, criticism or dissent, without allowing anything to get in the way of all of that, which is, again, why everything was so powerful with Francis. So within that, again, what do you say about, contemporary Eucharistic engagement, within all of this? Well, from, our understanding of our heritage of Francis, we begin to see that Eucharist, again, is the great work of salvation. It's the work that helps us understand what it means to be saved. And what it means to be saved is not to get into heaven. It means to understand our purpose, our meaning, our life here and now, how wonderful and glorious that is in this here and now. Again, this is food for today. It is the food for now, before it becomes the food for heaven. It may have been bread that came down from heaven, but now it's being consumed and eaten and enjoyed right here and right now to become something that shapes and molds us and creates something wonderful inside of us. It's an event that happens to us and acts upon us. Again, a God who wants us and loves us is going to do those things that are going to make sure that we know that. And Eucharist should experience that. It's an event. It's not just dire liturgy. Again, bad liturgy is not Franciscan liturgy. We don't, to be in a quiet, if you want a quiet, place to pray, Well, do that outside of time for Eucharistic, liturgy, because Eucharistic liturgy is meant to be vibrant and alive. It's meant to engage people. It's meant to make connections, to reinforce relationships. It is praise and edification. It is praising God, but remembering we praise God because we know that God builds us up. Again, it's not done for God. It's, again, done for us. And so basically, we do not deconstruct, the liturgy in the interests of simplicity and poverty. Sometimes the brothers are like, oh, it would be just nice if we kind of just sat in silence for the entire time. No, that is not what we're supposed to be doing, and we're not supposed to be taking things apart because, Franciscans are supposed to be poor. If there's anything that we throw all of our effort into, it is in the sense of Eucharist, of recognizing the God within us and among us. Because without that, we would not be who we are. This God who came to us to say, I want this group to be formed. And Francis, you are the one to be the axis upon which it all begins to form. Those important things. Again, what is brought out of all of this, again, is a hierarchy, a value and dignity, in authentic participation, is that people share in this to the extent that they can and in ways that they can, because it's important that they do. And if someone is not involved in this in the way that they can, well, then something suffers in the celebration of it. The reality is always that all members of the community have a responsibility to contribute, for salvation, for salvation to be effective in creation. It's what our doing as a people of God. It's what our doing as believers, as people who receive the Eucharist, do, that allows for salvation to be effective. And again, salvation not getting into heaven, but salvation recognizing the fact that there is great meaning here in this world that we have yet to uncover and discover in our lives. And unless we do that, then the process of God's work of bringing to fulfillment what God began from the beginning of time, it takes more time. It will come to its fulfillment, but the more that we participate in it, the more that we contribute to it, it will speed it up. And we'll see that wonder and that beauty that God says will be the fullness of time, sooner than we can imagine, sooner than we can think, sooner than we can realize. So that's just a little bit, just to kind of give you that right now in the little time that we have left. So if it led to any questions, fantastic. If you all want to go home, that's great too.
Well, thank you so much, Father Sabak, Father Jim, for your lecture. This opportunity is brought to you all by the Franciscan School of Theology Development Department. And let's give Father Jim a virtual round of applause.